The first time I met David, he smiled at me with perfect warmth. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his eye contact direct but not uncomfortable. He asked how my drive over had been, commented on the weather, and offered me coffee with just the right amount of friendly concern. By all appearances, he was the model of a charming, well-adjusted professional. And yet, as we sat in that sterile interview room of the psychiatric facility, I knew I was face to face with a man who had stabbed his business partner 17 times over a minor disagreement about their company's logo design. "I don't understand why everyone makes such a fuss," David said casually, stirring his coffee. "People get angry. Things happen. Life goes on." His voice carried no remorse, no anxiety, just mild puzzlement at others' reactions to what he had done. As a psychologist specializing in forensic cases, I've encountered many individuals society labels as psychopaths. But David was different. Most violent offenders I'd interviewed showed some awareness of social norms, even if they chose to violate them. David genuinely couldn't comprehend why his actions were considered extreme. More striking still, throughout our lengthy evaluation sessions, his physiological markers remained remarkably stable. Even when discussing his crime in graphic detail, his heart rate, perspiration, and pupil dilation showed no significant change. David had a condition that's fascinated and disturbed scientists for decades. He literally couldn't feel fear. And his case offers a window into the complex neuroscience of psychopathy that goes far beyond the simplistic portrayals we see in movies and media. To understand what makes someone like David different, we need to start with the amygdala, an almond-shaped structure deep within the brain that serves as our emotional processing center. Neuroimaging studies have consistently found that individuals with psychopathic traits show reduced amygdala volume and activity, particularly when viewing fearful or distressing images that would normally trigger strong responses in most people. In David's case, an fMRI revealed something even more extreme. His amygdala response was almost non-existent, not just to fearful stimuli, but to all emotional content. This wasn't just psychopathy as we typically understand it. It was a profound disconnection between the cognitive and emotional systems of his brain. "I know I should feel bad," David told me during our third session. "I've read books about emotions. I understand the concept of guilt, but it's like trying to explain color to someone born blind. I can learn what the words mean, but I can't experience the feeling itself." This kind of emotional blindness is at the heart of psychopathy. The condition is characterized by a constellation of traits: superficial charm, lack of empathy, impulsivity, and perhaps most significantly, reduced fear response. But contrary to popular belief, these traits exist on a spectrum rather than as an all-or-nothing diagnosis. Dr. Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist, revised, PCLR, the gold standard assessment tool in the field, evaluates 20 different characteristics to generate a score ranging from 0 to 40. The average person scores around 4 or 5. Serial killers and other extreme cases typically score above 30. David scored a 36, placing him in the highest percentile of psychopathic traits ever measured. But here's where the science gets particularly interesting. Psychopathy isn't necessarily a sentence to violence or criminality. Studies suggest that approximately 1% of the general population meets the clinical criteria for psychopathy, yet the vast majority never commit violent crimes. In fact, certain environments and professions may actually reward the fearlessness, decisiveness, and emotional detachment that characterize the condition. Take James, another individual I assessed with a PCLR score of 28, well into the range of clinically significant psychopathy. Unlike David, James channeled his traits into a successful career as a trauma surgeon. His ability to remain calm under pressure, make quick decisions without emotional interference, and detach from the suffering around him made him exceptionally effective in the operating room. "When everyone else is panicking, I'm at my best," James told me. "Blood doesn't bother me. Screaming doesn't bother me. I just see the problem that needs solving." The stark contrast between David and James raises a crucial question. If both men share similar neurological profiles, why did one become a violent offender while the other became a respected physician? The answer lies in what scientists call the successful psychopath hypothesis, the idea that environmental factors, secondary personality traits, and early interventions can channel psychopathic tendencies into socially acceptable or even beneficial outlets. Genetics certainly play a role. Twin studies suggest that psychopathic traits are about 50% heritable. A variation in the MAOA gene, sometimes sensationally called the warrior gene, has been linked to increased aggression and reduced empathy. But genetics are only part of the story. Childhood experiences appear critical in determining whether psychopathic tendencies lead to destructive outcomes. James grew up in a stable, middle-class household with clear boundaries and consequences. His parents, recognizing his emotional differences early on, provided consistent structure and explicitly taught him the social rules that didn't come naturally to him. "My mother used to say I was born without certain instincts, so she had to teach me manually," James recalled. "She would literally explain why other children were crying or scared, what I should say to them, how I should act. It was like learning a foreign language, but it worked." David's childhood couldn't have been more different. Abandoned by his mother at age 4, he bounced between foster homes where he experienced both neglect and abuse. Without stable attachment figures or consistent boundaries, his natural tendencies toward manipulation and rule-breaking were reinforced rather than redirected. "I learned early that adults were either threats to neutralize or resources to exploit," David explained with clinical detachment. "By 8, I could make foster parents feel so sorry for me they'd give me anything I wanted. By 12, I could make them afraid of me when that worked better." This combination of neurological differences and environmental factors creates what researchers call the perfect storm for violent psychopathy. The brain's fear-processing mechanisms fail to develop normally, leaving the individual without the internal alarm system that helps most people avoid dangerous or socially destructive behaviors. Without external structures to compensate for this internal deficit, the result can be a person who literally doesn't understand why they shouldn't hurt others if it benefits them. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of interviewing someone like David is realizing that his moral reasoning isn't just different, it's operating on an entirely different framework. For most people, moral decisions involve both rational calculation and emotional response. We don't steal, not just because it's illegal, but because we empathize with the victim's loss and would feel guilty afterwards. For David, morality is purely transactional. "I understand the concept of rules," he told me. "If you break them and get caught, there are consequences. That's useful information. But the idea that rules exist because people's feelings matter, that's just inefficient sentimentality." This perspective isn't merely callous. It reflects a fundamentally different way of processing social information. Psychopaths like David can intellectually comprehend others' emotions, but they experience them as distant abstractions rather than compelling realities. It's what psychologists call knowing without feeling. This emotional blindness affects far more than just fear. Recent research suggests that psychopaths have difficulty recognizing and responding appropriately to all emotions, particularly sadness and disgust. This may explain their often baffling inability to learn from emotional experiences that would profoundly impact most people. After being convicted of assault in his 20s, David participated in a standard prison rehabilitation program focused on building empathy through victim impact statements. When asked what he learned, his response was telling, "I learned that if you stab someone, people get very upset and talk about it for much longer than seems reasonable. I'll remember that for my cost-benefit analysis next time I'm angry." He had absorbed the information without internalizing its emotional significance, a hallmark of the psychopathic mind. Yet our understanding of psychopathy continues to evolve in surprising ways. One of the most intriguing recent findings comes from studies of psychopaths' decision-making under different language conditions. When presented with moral dilemmas in their native language, psychopaths show the characteristically utilitarian responses we expect. The ends justify the means, emotional considerations are irrelevant, etc. But when the same individuals consider identical dilemmas in a second language they learned later in life, their responses become notably more similar to non-psychopathic controls. This suggests that the emotional detachment associated with psychopathy may be partially context-dependent rather than absolute. This aligns with emerging evidence that certain forms of therapy can help individuals with psychopathic traits develop cognitive empathy, the intellectual understanding of others' emotions, even if they never fully experience emotional empathy, as most people do. Dr. Kent Keel, a leading researcher in the neuroscience of psychopathy, has pioneered programs that focus on teaching psychopathic offenders to systematically analyze the consequences of their actions and the perspectives of others. While participants don't suddenly develop normal emotional responses, they can learn to integrate these considerations into their decision-making processes, potentially reducing harmful behaviors. These findings offer a more nuanced view than the born evil narrative that dominates popular culture. Psychopaths aren't supernatural monsters or simply bad people. They're individuals with specific neurological differences that dramatically affect how they experience and interact with the world. I witnessed this reality in a particularly striking way during my final session with David. As part of a standard assessment battery, I showed him a series of images designed to evoke various emotional responses while monitoring his physiological reactions. When presented with photos of injured children that would distress most viewers, his vital signs remained unchanged. Then I showed him a picture of a prison cell. For the first time, his measurements shifted, not dramatically but measurably. When I asked what he was thinking, he responded with unusual hesitation, "I don't like confined spaces. Being locked up is inefficient. It prevents me from doing what I want." It wasn't fear, as most would recognize it, but it was the closest approximation David could experience, a rational recognition of a scenario that would limit his autonomy. And in that moment, I glimpsed the profound isolation of his condition. Without the shared emotional language that connects most humans, he navigated a world that must seem bizarrely irrational, filled with people making decisions based on feelings he could observe, but never truly comprehend. This doesn't excuse David's actions or suggest that individuals with severe psychopathy shouldn't be held accountable for harmful behaviors. But it does challenge us to reconsider simplistic notions of good and evil, and to recognize that the most disturbing aspects of human behavior often have complex neurobiological roots. The science of psychopathy continues to advance, with promising research into early intervention strategies for children showing callous, unemotional traits, the developmental precursors to adult psychopathy. Studies suggest that specialized parenting approaches emphasizing consistent rewards and consequences, explicit emotional education, and cultivation of whatever capacity for attachment exists can significantly improve outcomes. For adults with psychopathic traits, traditional therapy focused on emotional insight is largely ineffective. However, programs targeting concrete behaviors, clear consequences, and appealing to self-interest show more promise. A psychopath may never care about others' suffering for its own sake, but they can learn that causing such suffering typically results in outcomes that disadvantage them personally. James, the surgeon I mentioned earlier, represents this adapted approach to living with psychopathic traits. "I don't naturally care if my patients live or die on an emotional level," he acknowledged, "but I've trained myself to recognize that their survival is critical to my professional success and reputation. My self-interest aligns with keeping them alive, so I excel at it." Perhaps most importantly, understanding the neuroscience of psychopathy reminds us that the human mind is far more diverse than our everyday experiences suggest. Most of us assume others perceive the world roughly as we do, with similar emotional responses to similar situations. But conditions like psychopathy reveal this assumption to be profoundly mistaken. As I watched David being led back to his cell after our final session, I was struck by the parallel journeys of our understanding, both of psychopathy itself and of individuals who experience it. We've moved from simplistic moral condemnation to recognition of complex neurobiological differences, from viewing psychopaths as inhuman monsters to seeing them as humans with specific cognitive variations that dramatically affect their experience of the world. This doesn't mean abandoning moral judgment or excusing harmful actions. David belongs in a secure facility, not because he's evil in some metaphysical sense, but because his particular brain configuration, life history, and learned behaviors make him genuinely dangerous to others. Understanding the science behind his condition doesn't change that reality, but it does give us better tools for addressing it effectively. And perhaps most importantly, understanding cases like David's and James's helps us recognize the spectrum of human neurological differences that shape our society in ways both challenging and beneficial. The same traits that make someone like David dangerous in one context might make someone like James exceptionally valuable in another. The Man Who Couldn't Feel Fear offers us a window not just into the science of psychopathy, but into the profound diversity of human minds and the complex interplay of nature and nurture that shapes all of us, a reminder that beneath the surface of our shared humanity lies a universe of difference in how we each experience the world. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me through this exploration of psychopathy and the neuroscience behind it. If you found this interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology that shapes human behavior. Drop a comment with your thoughts or questions, and let me know what psychological topics you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, keep being curious about the complex minds all around you.